All right, big wood hill country whitetails, probably one of my favorite ways to hunt whitetails, and that's because with terrain, with elevation, with big woods, these deer can get some age on them. And with age becomes typically bigger bucks, and who doesn't like to hunt bigger bucks? But the end all be all is it takes work, and that starts with digital scouting. So today I'm gonna walk you through my process of using onX to do some digital scouting, and that's applicable for postseason and in season. So for me, it starts with aerials. For me, I need to go in and look at the aerials and know a deer needs a reason to be in that general area. And when you start talking about big woods, when you start talking about hill country, a lot of times there's not much structure. You know, you're around zero ag, so that structure for me becomes TSI. I'm looking for clear cuts, I'm looking for maybe a select cut, and then also some terrain features. That is my starting point. So one of the things with finding structure in the big woods is, again, I said having a reason for deer to be there. But when you start looking at these clear cuts, one, they offer cover, two, they offer an incredible amount of browse. Outside of clear cuts, you can look for oaks, which is a lot harder to find. You can use some layer tools there to possibly look at the aerials and maybe identify, hardwoods from pine stands or hardwoods from clear cuts, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, when I'm looking for a starting point, I'm looking for that structure, I'm looking for that TSI, and I'm basically looking at a mile or two radius for possible bedding opportunities, just to get started. Again, this is a starting point. So as you see on my onX, this portion that we're looking at right here, it looks like there's some TSI going on. And one big thing is on these different clear cuts and select cuts, they're all different ages. So there's a lot of habitat variety in this particular area. So that's step number one, find a reason for deer to be in the general area. So I have my general area laid out. Now I'm going to go ahead and go over to the topo and talk about some general rules of thumb. Now, when we start talking about buck bedding in hill country, a lot of the stuff that I have learned over the years has came from the hunting beast. So there's a couple very general rules of thumb. Number one, when you're in hill country, you want to know what the predominant wind direction is. A lot of times these bucks will use these ridge systems on the leeward side of that ridge. And all leeward means is basically downwind. So if you have a west wind predominant in that area, they're going to want to use that east side of the ridge where the wind is blowing over top of that ridge, and it gives them a little more advantage. There's a thing called a wind tunnel, essentially, where the wind is blowing over top of the ridge and you have rising thermals, and there's an area, and a lot of people say it's the upper 1/3. I'm sure you guys have heard that before. So that gives bucks a little more advantage when you start talking about ag ground or swamps or etc. They can have the wind direction and the thermals and their eyes. So that's one of the challenging things about hill country. But as you see here on the hybrid mode, we can see both these clear cuts, select cuts, so we have our structure, and then you can also get an idea of the direction of these ridge systems. Now, for bedding purposes, we're not going in here trying to find or mark the X, like this is a spot. That's not what we're trying to do when we're in here digital scouting. We want to be able to identify possible bedding opportunities. And then with our postseason scouting or boots in the ground scouting in season, we can go in there and qualify these areas. So again, you can see here, we have kind of a north to south ridge. So we have a southwest predominant wind here. So all we're going to do is go into this ridge system and we're going to look for secondary points. Those secondary points, some people call them spurs, some people call them fingers, some people call them secondary ridges. Whatever terminology you use, it doesn't really matter, but all you're looking for are those little ridges going off the main ridge on the leeward side of the ridge system. So I'm gonna go ahead and go straight into topographical mode where I can see my topo lines just a little bit easier. So as you can see here, this ridge is kind of what we're identifying. It's one ridge system over from our structure. And all I'm going to do is look at these points or these spurs and drop a pin in relation to where I think there could be a buck bedding opportunity. So you can see here there's a road system here. And then on this upper side, on the top side of this ridge, there's a hiking trail or a bridle trail. And from my experience, that's not a reason not to look at this spot. Oftentimes you'll find bucks, specifically 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old bucks, are doing something a little bit different than those 2 and 3-year-old deer. And that's why they've been able to get the 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And a lot of times their bedding will set up to where they have a visual advantage over a road system or over a trail because it allows them to monitor any kind of human intrusion. So again, just looking at this ridge system, knowing that if people use this, there's going to be pressure up top, there's a road on the bottom, and all I'm going to do is kind of come in here and identify these spurs. So here we have a nice little spur coming out in this bowl system, and with a southwest wind, that allows any buck to kind of get out on this point on that upper 1/3 and have a visual advantage and have a scent advantage, both over the road, the wind blowing over their back, and any kind of noise or anything like that coming up top. So this would be a buck bedding opportunity. So we would drop a pin right there. We have that bedding opportunity marked, and we're going to go do the same thing down through this ridge, because to go in and put boots on the ground in the big woods, it takes time. And if there's only one pin in that area, it's not a very efficient way to scout. So we're going to go ahead and mark drop waypoints on every secondary ridge or spur down through this ridge system. So when we get up to that upper 1/3 on this ridge, we can be efficient with our time. We can check multiple spots out all in the same trip and kind of maximize our scouting opportunities. So as you see a little bit further to the south, we have this really big high point and where this road kind of wraps around. So with all this kind of coming together down on the southern part of this ridge, I would assume, as far as human intrusion, most people are going to access this from the south. They're going to come up, either park here, shoot straight up this top, or use or cut over to this trail. So a possible bedding opportunity could be just right on this kind of, it's a very small point. Let me zoom in. But you can see where these topo lines bump out right here. And we have a nice little flat spot or saddle. With a southwest wind, a deer could use any part of this point right here for a possible bed. So we're going to go ahead and drop another pin there. So we have 2 buck beds or possible bedding opportunities marked on this ridge, and we're just going to go out here and repeat this process, and then we're going to jump to some variables that you might find in the big woods. So we talked about some general rules of thumb, leeward side of ridges, secondary points, to establish a starting point. From my experience, what we found in the big woods is that those 5, 6, 7-year-old bucks aren't always doing the same thing as younger deer. And I was fortunate enough to hunt several big deer in this same type of terrain, in this same setting. And those deer weren't necessarily using that upper 1/3, but they were in certain areas that gave them a similar advantage. So you could see on my Onyx, I'm kind of zoomed in here, and what we're looking at is what basically I would call a bowl. In hill country, the winds can get awful tricky. The weatherman might be calling for a west wind, and you might be set up in an area where the wind is blowing to the east. And that's just the nature of the beast when you're in hill country, the wind bouncing, following bottoms, just swirling, doing a lot of different things. Now, when it comes to bowls, over the last couple of years, again, I had the opportunity to hunt a couple very big specific deer that weren't following that upper 1/3 rule, but they were using these bowls to their advantage where they were bedded lower down the ridge system. But when you get in these different types of scenarios like bowls, thermals can become a very, very big factor depending on the steepness of the terrain. And I'll give an example where I was hunting a deer and I was hunting the western face of a ridge system down in a bowl with dark timber, but the side I was hunting him on was facing to the north. And the sun was so far to the south and the ridge systems were so deep, the thermals would fall there until very late in the morning, almost into the early afternoon, just because of the way the sun was hitting the forest floor. So when you get in these bowl type scenarios, we've seen this kind of replay a few times now, where deer or older bucks specifically will use these bowls because they have more of a variable wind So it's not a constant wind blowing over their back, but they have more of a variable wind where they can scent check more from their bed, and they rely on the thermals more than the wind, necessarily the wind direction, but they also have that visual. So a lot of times if you have like this bowl that I'm showing here, you can see these topo lines are starting to spread out where it's a little bit flatter. But about 2/3 of the way down the ridge, it starts to get a little steeper. So a lot of times you'll find those bucks bedded on the flat next to the steep where they can kind of have a visual advantage, and then they have the thermals and the wind kind of all doing different things. So they're using 3 key senses there to ensure that they're safe.